Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. I made it back to my house about 2 minutes ago because I had drinkies with Kevin Hemel, Mr. Patton. He's over on a tour, so I left it a bit fine before getting here. But I'm here now. Anyway, the miracle of Dunkirk was due in part to some critical rearguard actions. The 12th Lancers fought for canals and towns, some famous and some not so famous. Philip Watson joins us to explain more. His book, Their Greatest Hour, is in the links below. Here's my copy here. There's the plug done. You can find the links, as I always in the description below. I'll bring Phil in now. Good evening, sir. How are you today?
I'm really good, Paul. It's good to be back. Good to see you again. Thank you.
So, just in top of the show there, we are the focus of Dunkirk is always the getting the men off the beaches. And it's an amazing story, and it has all the elements that make it an enduring story. But it does mean that some of these critical actions that occurred before and critically after that don't get talked about as much. I mean, we're concentrating on a kind of a few days period for your regiment, but I'm sure you're going to agree with me that the focus on the beaches is meaning we're ignoring these stories.
I think so. I think the fact is that it epitomizes that's being British, which is stoic men on beaches and also almost divine deliverance as people are then being rescued off beaches. But we never really ask ourselves, apart from the big thing like the Haltba fail, what led to the ability to have that incredible period of time by which those evacuations took place. And I think, as we know, there's all sorts of other presenters have thrown their pennies worth in just to add those extra dimensions, and I think that's all we're really doing today, just throwing spinning another plate and just looking at those other contributing factors, nothing more.
Yeah, well, folks, I'm going to hand over to our guest to take us through this. There's lots of slides coming your way, lots of details, so I won't necessarily fire away with your questions immediately because Philip has kind of built in some breaks for questions, but I think some of them will be asked as the presentation goes on. But I'm going to hand over to our guest to take us through this story and back to 1940 in the British Army in France.
Brilliant. As Paul said, it's a slide-driven presentation, which means that when this goes up on YouTube, you can go back and look at it. And I always put all my footnote references, so you can have a look at what I've said, either check my homework or just expand just a little differently. The key to this slide is a very famous quote that Gort apparently said, that without the 12th Lancers, only a small part of the army would have reached Dunkirk. And that's what we would like to look at. But there's a flavour to the presentation this evening. And as we can see there, we were massively blessed by Her Majesty the Queen, who wrote the foreword to my book shortly during the period over the coronation itself. The key to it is, and you'll see as we go through that, Her Majesty the Queen's father, Bruce Shand, is one of the characters in today's story. But in the foreword, what she did, which she did write herself, she clearly says there that actually amongst the military mastery, though, mistakes were made and friends were lost. In most regimental histories, they tend to be a little bit eulogistic, and we never talk about what goes wrong. To be honest, I'm not going to talk about what goes wrong today. That's not the purpose of this presentation. However, notwithstanding that this is not an action where everything goes perfectly to plan. Four sort of notices. It's going to have a regimental bias, of which I make no apologies. The war diary, first port of call for any historian, was retrospective. It didn't survive the water of Dunkirk, and it was typed up afterwards, so it contains lots of post-event rationalisation. The man that writes the regimental history is a guy called Captain Pat Stewart. He wasn't a 12th Lancer. In fact, he was an 11th Hussar, and that in itself is hugely significant, as we'll see later on. But if we're looking at being academics, that I would say that you can't look at the 12th Lancers regimental history as being a primary source because he wasn't there. And lastly, and I apologise, my butchery of the French language, all the place names will have an Anglo pronunciation, and please do not judge me poorly for it. So by way of just an introduction, the world didn't need another book on Dunkirk. The 12th Lancers themselves in the official history by Ellis, we were really well represented. And then as the books then flowed off the presses, Sebag Montefiori's Dunkirk, and I only picked that one because it was advertised in our regimental journal when it was published. We only get half a dozen mentions over about 5 pages. And then the last guy, I think, to do Dunkirk on this site was Colonel Bob. Brilliant book. I bought it. And we only get a single mention. And unfortunately, it's by the Germans. And the Germans misidentify the Lancers as being the 17th Lancers. So what we're seeing, I can see, in the historiography of the 12th Lancers for Dunkirk, from where we started to where we are, the story is becoming somewhat dilute. So this evening, the idea is just to try and put us back to where we maybe should be and nothing more. As Woody said, we're going to do it in 4 parts. We're going to look at mechanisation and modernisation and the threats of amalgamation, which if anybody from the serving regiment is watching this evening, which I suspect they will be, mechanisation is a euphemism that the cavalry uses for the loss of the horses. Everybody else just purely saw it as modernisation and nothing more. The guy that brought this to my attention is another cavalry officer guy called Dick Taylor, and I took this straight out of one of Dick's books, so I thank him for that. And here's a little cartoon. It says lots. It's taken from the Regimental Journal. If you look on the left-hand side, you can see an armoured car, and the guys are just sat around drinking tea and coffee and not doing a lot. And on the right-hand side, you can see the guys mucking out the horses and moving bales, etc. And one guy's pointing to what the future looks like. And they know what the future looked like because the mechanisation process took from about May 1928 to December 1929. And each of the squadrons received their armoured cars in turn. So once B squadron had got theirs, A squadron knew what was coming next. And the big thing that they noticed, of course, is you can park an armoured car up on a Friday, leave it in the hangars over weekend, and then you don't need to muck it out or feed it over the weekend, which is what everybody else was doing. So in the great cavalry debate that the cavalry didn't want to lose their horses, amongst the soldiers, nothing could be further from the truth. The sop for the officers was they were allowed to keep one charger and a groom, and they retained those horses until the outbreak of the Second World War. Those that watched my last presentation, I know you guys came across and watched me on World War I TV. You know I like a bit of doctrine, but on the left-hand side, you can see tank and armoured car training, 1927. And that tells you the transition of who owned the armoured cars before the cavalry. Of course, the tank corps were not the first to own the armoured cars, and we don't have time to go into that. And we're just looking at the transition from the Royal Tank Corps to the cavalry. But on the right-hand side, it's a bit of a cartoon again, and it's just making tongue-in-cheek of the difficulties of squeezing very tall officers and men into very small armoured cars, which is a modern problem of today. But it clearly mentions tank and armoured car training 1927. For people like myself, and I know when we did this with Woody last time, we talked about the problem with doctrine of the Second World War, which there is the consensus that you had it, but nobody read it. Well, you can see quite clearly here on the modernisation programme, the 12th Lancers were at least aware of the doctrine and were quoting and reading it. A bit of a smoking gun for me, hugely useful. But this is where things become confusing. Well, certainly not confusing, complicated, because the mechanisation programme was not simultaneous. It took 5 turns of the wheel. Phase 1, the 12th Lancers and the 11th Hussars were done in 1928. And if I say to you, in those 5 phases, stage 4 and 5 was not until 1941 and 1942. From the period of 1928 to 1942, the cavalry had a mixed culture of mechanised cavalry training and horsed training. So it was a dual culture for all of that period of time. And during that period while the 12th Lancers were waiting for their armoured cars, the first ones they were waiting for was the Rolls-Royce. They maintained a culture of mix. As you can see there, we're still doing our gymkhanas, we're still doing our musical rides on our horses. We've got our armoured cars. For each troop, they were issued motorcycles as well. So the regiment during that period from the March until the December had a mixed culture of both horsed and mechanised training. Now, this is where the armoured car training manuals first come in 1931. And these are now written by the Armoured Corps, and by the cavalry, and particularly the 11th Hussars and the 12th Lancers. These are showing some reconnaissances in 1931, while the 12th Lancers were based in Cairo. The longest reconnaissance was 1,000 miles. During that 1,000 miles with their radios, they communicated between Cairo and Alexandria over 500 miles. The trips were over 20 days long, and when they were into the desert, they were supported by the Air Force, who were dropping fuel and rations and water ahead of them. This is in 1931. And all of the squadrons conducted similar exercises. And it was during these exercises where they started to look at the transition from mounted reconnaissance doctrine to armoured car reconnaissance doctrine. Fantastic picture here, another cartoon. But I'll leave it on the screen. I'm not going to read it. But what it talks about specifically, those of you who are either radio hams or have military service and are familiar with HF communications, this is what they're talking about. It is the ability to talk over long distances, in this case from a box body lorry with a radio, with a mast and a transmitter. But you can see there he's talking about tapping it out many times in Morse, and the atmospherics were very pronounced. If people fundamentally understand how high frequency works, it does rely on the ionosphere to keep the background noise out of the communications, and HF is notoriously very noisy. The ionosphere breaks down as the sun goes down. So normally at night there are no HF comms, and in the winter they close down about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So this is something to bear in mind as we go through, because communications is probably the sub-narrative to the whole of this. What is the USP of the Lancers during this period, which enables them to provide the information that is required? And it's a period of 6 years they were in Egypt. Here they are out on exercise. You see different types of camouflage. They're experimenting. And Horsby Porter, who we'll hear about later on, he said that the 6 years in Egypt was where the regiment learnt its role, free from the interference of the War Office, meaning, of course, that they were defining and creating their doctrine. For those that have heard me speak before, I absolutely fundamentally believe tactical doctrine is driven from the bottom up, and this is how doctrine was being written by the men in the desert over a 6-year period. Now let's have a look. This is what the order of battle looked like. It's a 1941, but it's exactly the same on the outbreak of war and before. You can see how many Morris armoured cars there are. There's 3 in the squadron headquarters. Each troop, 1, 2, and 3, get 3 Morrises each. As you can see, they've all got a smattering of motorcycles. There's some staff cars, and the administration is by trucks. I'm not going to go down a wormhole of trucks, or whether they were Bedfords or Morrises. I simply don't have the detail. But at the end of this presentation, if people do know, inbox me and just help me pad out this presentation with some of the correct vehicles. I'll be most grateful indeed. But as we can see there, it's completely mechanised. But do a bit of maths. 3, 6, 9, 12. Okay, there are 12 armoured cars per squadron. Okay, we've got 3 squadrons. That makes 36. 2 for RHQ. That's 38 armoured cars in a regiment. And this was the difference. And it's called a capability. Historians love going down wormholes of whether people wanted to do things, didn't want to do things, whether they dug in, it didn't matter. But the reality is, if you look at a squadron that's mechanised and you look at a squadron that's horsed, if you were the commanding officer and you had to stick out reconnaissance patrols with a squadron, even by jiggling them around and making them work in pairs instead of 3s, and even by using the squadron leader and the 2IC's vehicles, you can only put 6 cars out in pairs, whereas sections in troops with an NCO or an officer plus 6 or 7, you can put out 16 patrols. So the first thing that happens on modernisation or mechanisation, we have a capability shortfall that the cavalry cannot put out as many armoured cars and doing reconnaissance screens as it could, but what it has gained, of course, is tremendous mobility. After the Rolls-Royce armoured cars, this is 12th Lancers again, came the Lanchesters. And when they returned back to England, they did the first of their operational tours. They had a very small jaunt out to Saarbrücken, to the Saarland, watching the plebiscite being delivered back post-World War I. And then Captain Willis found himself attached to the Transjordanian Frontier Force and got himself a military cross in the process. So those 6 years spent in the desert clearly came to fruition. And there are some fantastic pen pictures of each other. And he's described as his brother officers as idiosyncratic as ever, dressed inevitably in an old cloth coaching coat that had belonged to his uncle, a red side hat, and he treated the enemy and officers with an impartial and refreshing lack of respect. And I'll try and remember some of the other vignettes of the others. However, at the end of the whole of the process, when we're transitioning from vehicles, from horses to vehicles, this is what was said. And this is written by the colonel of the regiment, actually, of the 11th Hussars, because, of course, they're doing exactly the same as we are. And he said that the future and the esprit de corps of the fine cavalry spirit for which these two regiments have been distinguished for 200 years will be preserved. And there is little doubt that they will maintain their high position in cavalry circles, which they have held for many years. And that was by William Birdwood. And this was also supported, and we'll see what Pittman says later on. But this is about the preservation of a spirit, not a horse. And of course, although not said, the reason that the 12th and the 11th Hussars were actually chosen was they were the junior regiments of the Armoured Corps. So there was always the worry that by being the first to mechanise, in some way, their position and status being the juniors of the Corps in some way would be lost. And William Birdwood, Field Marshal, gets right behind the process. We're going to talk about reconnaissance, and this is just to remind people there is other types of reconnaissance going on, and we're really just going to be talking about the strategic reconnaissance that Gort used the 12th Lancers for. There are 3 corps who all have their own division of reconnaissance in the light tanks, and although we don't touch on it, but only briefly at the end, we have Phantom Force. Okay, he's also providing reconnaissance for the BAF. We have a regimental story with Piers Edgecombe. People will know about that. Probably, and Phantom Force, and I'll touch on the casualties and the fatalities at the end of the war at this presentation, just to bring it all back round. But our sister regiment, the 9th Lancers, were also doing reconnaissance, but in light tanks. So that's where we come to. I'm not sure if there's any questions at this point, but the next thing we're going to look at is how they mobilise, how they embark, and that very English thing, the phony war.
Well, I mean, we really had questions that you've pretty much covered, and it's like, how did the British think cavalry would be used? And you kind of said that it's basically reconnaissance and screening. But Gordy did just say that, are they taking any notice of what the Germans are doing in Poland in 1939? I mean, you're talking about a doctrine that's taken them, I think 28 to 40 to sort of refine. I assume at that point they're not particularly noticing and taking a note of what's happening in Poland.
Probably the reason is, and that being patronizing, it's a good question. First of all, in 39, most of 39, they're sat in villages, freezing their bits off in a very bitter winter. The absolute reality is, and Tim Bishop, who we look at later on, he summarizes it. He says, all we're doing is what we did on horses, we're doing it in armoured cars, we're just doing it faster. So it is the reconnaissance screen. Now, of course, when we do these presentations for the World War I, we talk about the different roles of the cavalry, because the cavalry is entirely viewed through what we call arme blanche, the mounted cavalry charge. We forget about patrolling, screening, pickets, convoys, escorts. All of those things still need to be done. Whether we feel we can conduct a charge action in an armoured car, or whether we can see something like this is an aggressive act of war, is something we can look at as we go through the presentation.
Brilliant. Okay, so let's move on.
Okay. So here she is, the beast. Morris, CS9, armoured car. So at this stage, in the 6 years, they're now on their 3rd platform. And it's built on a commercial vehicle. It's armed with a Boy's anti-tank rifle, about 0.5, and a Bren gun, which everybody will be familiar with. It's a crew of 4. You'll notice on the right-hand side, it's got an open turret, not very good for protecting the crew from anything that's coming in from above, whether it be shrapnel or the weather. But on the left-hand side, you can see there's a door, and that's where the 4th crewman is, and he is the radio operator. And the radio itself, okay, is also has a Morse capability. And the only thing to say at this stage is every single member of the crew was trained as a radio operator. Only the radio operator himself was trained to send messages by Morse. And during the winter period, the commanding officer made sure that everybody practiced this, which we'll mention as we go through. So a crew of 4, it's a Morris truck. And this is a picture of what the regiment looked like. This is the good old-fashioned, classic mobilisation picture. This is the officers' mess. See William Birdwood there in his flat cap to his left. And you can see Lumsden, the commanding officer. Just pause for 1 minute. Look left to right, look over the screen. How few medal ribbons there are. Okay, so this is a relative. There is not much World War I experience going to World War II. In fact, there are only 3 people in the regiment: the Padre, the commanding officer, and the French officer de liaison, a man called Henri de Falaise, who we will look at later on, who'd seen any World War I service whatsoever. And this is the list of officers in 1940. It is not significantly different to 39, but just look at the number of lieutenants and second lieutenants. The regiment, when it came back from Egypt, was 70 men under strength. As it was previously, the troops of the empire was always forward manned. The regiment came back, it left men behind. Due to struggling in recruiting, the officers went on a recruiting, emergency recruiting type affair, and what happened is they were called militiamen. And you can see here, there are some 22 officers between the rank of lieutenant and second lieutenant, and one of them who even would go on to command headquarters squadron. So by any stretch of the imagination, quite a young bunch of gentlemen, and you'll see Shand and people like that mentioned amongst those officers. This is Sergeant's Mess. They look, as you can see, again, you can see Birdwood and Lumsden there, but you can therefore see they are slightly older and a more mature group of gentlemen.
Yeah.
And this is a picture of Freddie Hunn. Many of those who, if any of the old comrades are watching this evening, will remember Freddie really well. Good old comrade, around for a long time. And he explains what happens. And what it is you have to bear in mind that when war's declared, the 11th Hussars are still over in Egypt. And like the First World War, anybody caught in the UK don't go back to Egypt. And anybody who is a reservist and is called up, they come to the 12th Lancers because that was the sister regiment. And they were the skills and trades they had. And as you can see, there was over 1,200 human beings to pick from. And they selected 27. And from that 27 people, it produced a wonderful mix of enthusiasm, seasoned and experienced officers and men from two different regiments, the 12th Lancers and the 11th Hussars. And there we talk about it. And Bruce Shand says, he says, what a good selection it was. And I know as a troop leader how much I owe to some of these old soldiers. So there's a recognition that this was a pretty good mix and a pretty good blend. And for the large part, 500 people were not chosen to deploy with the regiment in 1939. Freddie Hunn. So these are some of the guys we're going to talk about. On the left there, we've got Lumsden, not an unusual officer, but unusual by the fact is he'd already been to Staff College and had come back. Next, we have Andrew Horsbury Porter. Then we have Bruce Shand with his World War II medal ribbons, and that's taken from his wedding photograph. Then we have Tim Bishop, his best friend. And then bottom left, we had Edward Mann, Ned. And then we have a Royal Engineer, a guy called David Smith. Then we have the RSM, a guy called Freddie Fox. And on the right-hand side, we have the Agent Liaison, which is a guy called Henri de Falaise. And these are sort of the characters whose memoirs and letters we'll be dipping into as we go through the presentation. But war was declared. The first thing that happened was the regiment was based in Aldershot, and they were worried that Aldershot would be bombed. So the first thing they did was the old bomb burst out of Aldershot and into the local countryside and started their training. And here we see a fantastic picture of a place called Froyle House in Hampshire, where they moved into see the stables block, that looks like, and they're doing their exercising, waiting to be called forward for their embarkation. There's a fantastic ironic story. No, this is not how they went, okay, but this is exactly the same day, in exactly the same barracks that the 12th Lancers departed for the Boer War in 1899. So a massive deja vu moment for the regiment, going from the same barracks to do the same job on the same day. The only difference being, previously it was on horses, and this time it is in armoured cars. No change. Now we're going to talk about this, and this I mentioned earlier on. I think I mentioned it online, but certainly mentioned it to Woody at the beginning, which is it's to do with radios. My background as a reconnaissance soldier was in communications and in HF communications, so I do have an insight into how it functions, but maybe not how it functioned, specific radios at the time. Box body vehicle at top left, and it contained a number 3 wireless set, and this actually was never planned to go. Not only was the regiment not planned to go because it was supposed to be re-rolled to tanks, but the tanks never arrived. But when they embarked, it says in the war diary, they snuck these trucks off as water bowsers. I don't know how they got away with that. They don't really look like water bowsers. But the first thing it says there that Alan Windler and Major Smith, with their box body vehicle, the first thing they did when the regiment crossed the line, which we'll discuss later, went straight to GHQ. So what the regiment has is the ability to communicate using its HF radios direct to Gort, not via a brigade, not via a division or a corps. They are skipping at least 3 levels of command out and speaking direct. And the adjutant, Kennard, says, this set proved invaluable throughout the fighting which followed, and no less of a powerful set would have been any use. In the what-haves, could-haves, and should-haves of war, when you get to the end of this, if we just pause for a moment to think, what would have possibly happened if these trucks hadn't made the boat? The story would definitely have had a different ending. Understanding the mind of the commanding officer is always critical in all of these. And these are just a few quotes from the commanding officer. To be bored is a sign of inefficiency and incompetence. And during the phony war, he never allowed that to happen. He then says, too much stress cannot be laid upon the necessity of getting any information obtained as quickly as possible as you can, so it can be used by the commander. So if information is to be relevant, it has to be accurate and timely. To go from a regiment to a brigade to a division to Gort, there are too many links in that change for that. And then, of course, he tells his boys never to get involved. One may conclude, even at this early stage, they probably overlooked that one because there still was a fundamentally aggressive spirit amongst the cavalry officers and senior NCOs. So here we have, in Villers-Simon, during what we would now call the phony war, and during this period, despite the restrictions on fuel usage and radio silence, MCOM, Lumsden practiced and exercised his regiment throughout the whole of the Cold War period. And if anybody wants to then go across and read the Bartholomew report, which is really important, it talks about the difference and some of the lethargy that has slipped into some units during the period waiting for the war to begin. That definitely didn't happen with the 12th Lancers. And the way he got around, certainly to practice his long-range communications, was communications exercises always coincided with Paris race days, funnily enough, creating the distance to enable them to practice their communications. We've been and done our own battlefield studies. This is the farm. They absolutely know this story. They even took us into the barns and showed us the graffiti where the soldiers had scratched bits and pieces in the barns. So this is in Villers. But during this period, there's a good relationship, working relationship with the 12th Lancers and GHQ, particularly with an officer called Friend, General Friend, who actually had been in the same headquarters and establishments when the regiment was serving in Egypt. A young guy, David Smith, a group of reservists, territorials from the Royal Monmouth Royal Engineers, came and gave a talk about demolitions and stuff. Lumsden was particularly impressed and went to Friend and Lumsden and Gort and managed to get Smith and his 3 vehicles attached to the 12th Lancers for the rest of the campaign. And the significance of that, if we link Smith to the fortuitous incorporating of the vehicles, the radio vehicles, this is another one of those little key parts of the story where without it would have been different. But notice, Lance Sergeants, and all the guys apparently were all previously were Welsh miners. That was their previous occupation. So that's good, actually. We've got 4 slots to do. We've done 30 minutes, so we're on for the hour. That's just the scene setter. And before I take questions is, if I don't mention about the HF, if I don't mention about the cavalry spirit, if I don't mention about the training, I don't mention about the engineers or the radios, if I now start this story at part 3, it will not make sense. So I appreciate this has been a little bit of a long introduction into the story, but happy to take any questions at this point, Woody.
So you mentioned the 3 platforms they've had already, and so Sheldrake over in our resident general is saying, given the glacial pace of modern procurement, it seems that the pre-war cavalry benefited from a responsive, rapid system in acquiring platforms. Was that the case? I mean, as you said, there are a lot of lieutenants, second lieutenants. Is there this sort of a sense that these are the young and trendy and are there to get the new things? They seem to be moving through the quagmire well.
Certainly, it does say that the younger generation were lent into this hugely. The Royal Lancers at the moment, although it's a phrase from about 5 or 6 years ago, it's called platform agnostic. I love it. That if you were a trooper and you served from 1928 to 1945, you will serve on 7 platforms. These 3, plus Beaverette, plus Daimler, plus Humber, and you'll end up on Staghound. So that and the radio communications, certainly embracing the change. I think you're absolutely right that actually that is a part, that undercurrent is something that eased it through the process. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And then there are a couple of questions about the radios, both between the armored cars and the Bedford QLR you showed there. Ian said, are they communicating using voice and Morse? And I'm going to ask a kind of further question. Is there like a regimental net, and then there's the kind of the core level net? I mean, that famously happens in Normandy with regiments like the tank regiments. They have that inter-troop radio, and then they have the large. Do they have more than one net at this time?
Well, absolutely. So I like going down some G6 wiggly amp routes. So what you have got is it's predominantly voice, and we know that because they, in their diaries, they say that they can hear what each other said. If anyone's done Morse, and I am a Morse operator, which is you can't spell in your head. You have to wait till the conversation's over before you know what somebody said, unless anybody's particularly talking to you and you're listening. It's very difficult to just listen to a conversation. So most of it is voice. Go to Morse, of course, when communications get difficult. What you do is it would appear that all the troops are on a squadron net. Squadron goes back to regimental headquarters. Regimental headquarters then goes straight into Gort. So what you're looking at is two big nets, or one big net. Everybody, and there will be squadron nets going back into. So you've got three squadron nets going into RHQ, and then one net, one rear link, as we would call it. Just as we pause it, what's fascinating is that they embraced radio, and it says that the army at this time was skeptical. They say that, but also they took pigeons, passenger pigeons, with them as well. And they were on the backs of the vehicles, and the plan was to use them in case the radios didn't work. And the pigeons were carried, and I have no examples of them being used, but they actually had a French-speaking sergeant who went to Lille and arranged with a guy who kept pigeons, and they brought the pigeons to the regiment, and they kept the pigeons until Lille fell to the French. And up until that point, the troop leaders of each of the troop were still carrying pigeons on the back decks, while at the same time using radio communication. So very much a mixture of both the old and the new.
And that's another rabbit hole, but it is one of the stories of 1940. Famously, the French failure to embrace modern wireless communication, despite the fact they arguably have better tanks, better vehicles, certainly plenty of troops there, and they just can't talk to each other. It's a simple way of summing it up, but it is unfortunately the way it works in the French army in 1940. But that's a digression that we're not going to do today. Back to you, sir.
Okay, so let's get to the meat. Oh, I've got to press my slide. Okay, it's really significant to understand it in its entirety. So top left-hand corner up there, you've got Dunkirk. At Louvain there's the Dial River, or running through the Dial. Dial River running through Louvain. And when they get the orders to go on the 10th of May, the road move, by any stretch of the imagination, is about 4 hours. There's a border crossing to be done at Lannoy, and then they have to complete the rest of the journey to their deployment positions. Now, we have to remember that the relationship between the British and the French in the Second World War is significantly different to the First World War, because, of course, during the Second World War, they maintained absolute neutrality. So none of these routes have been wrecked. They've wrecked it as far as Brussels and Lannoy, but they've never crossed the border. So Shan says in his memoirs that they had memorized and practiced these routes on sand tables and all sorts of things. And this is the significance of, and we'll come back to where they go and what they do, but this is the significance of the role that the 12th Lancer play with Gort. And first of all, these are Gort's words from his own dispatch. He just says, he found out when the 12th Lancers could be ready. They said we'll be ready by 1 o'clock. Therefore, H hour was set at 1 o'clock when the Lancers could be ready, and not before. And in the official history written by Ellis, he then talks about right up to that point, they were on wireless silence, and then they crossed, and then the air recce started. So they were pretty well starting. Now, I know Hopkinson's mission, and I know Phantom Force were out there doing their own thing. That's not a part of this presentation, but this presentation in no way takes away from the fact is that we were not, the 12 Lancers were not the only people that were providing information. How they were providing it, and who they were providing it to, and the timescale involved. So that's what it is. So it is the 12th Lancers. Everything was set on them. And when they got it, that's when the plan was enacted. And the RV was at the bandstand at Lannoy. And Bruce Shand on the 10th writes in his own memoir, he arrived at Lannoy at Toufflin, where he and his friend Bishop we shared a lunch of bread and ham and a bottle of Moët Chandon, while they sat under the shelter of some high trees. Bruce Shand's own autobiography, Previous Encounters, is fantastic, but the only thing that Bruce Shand doesn't really talk about is himself. Incredibly self-effacing. If you want to learn about Bruce Shand, you have to read the books written by other people. In other words, his other friends. He tends not to write about himself. I must admit, Her Majesty the Queen does know this story, and she always wanted to know where her father shared this bottle of Moët Chandon with Tim Bishop. But somewhere in the region of the bandstand at Lannoy would appear to be where it is. But they crossed the border for the first time. And that's the first thing they're presented with. Very similar to the BF of 1914, who thought they were going north and had maps for Belgium, then found themselves going back to Paris and needed maps of France and didn't have any. The first thing was all the maps that they were issued were in French. And the first thing is they crossed the border to find all the road signs were in Flemish. And they do say that they expected the Flems to speak French, and they didn't. And they were very Flemish. And as you can see there, Tiernan and St. Troiden equates to Tilmont and St. Trond. And Bishop says that even the maps he had were 1918 vintage and were fine in the countryside, but no use whatsoever in the suburbs and the towns. And Horsby Porter himself says he had to go out and buy a Michelin road map. So as a reconnaissance regiment with inadequate maps is something probably almost unheard of today. That it's very difficult to report where the enemy are unless A, you know where you are and you need something to refer to on the ground. And that red arrow, I'm guessing, is roughly where the current road sign would be. But also note, if you look where Louvain is, that the River Dial, which was supposed to be the forward edge of the British, the Dial plan, but you can see the initial deployment positions of the 12th Lancers at Arschot and Dienst and Haarlem and Tilmont on the dotted line, that the first thing that the 12th Lancers did, they went well forward and well east of the Dial, as you would expect a reconnaissance regiment to do of the time. The next thing we have to look at really is the terrain. Normally we start something like this with a good old-fashioned ground brief, but when you look at the topography on the right-hand side, you can see Louvain, and that is the Dial River in the blue. But if you look on the left hand, you can see that if you're going to withdraw from where that red circle is in the centre to Dunkirk on the left, that's how many rivers you're going to have to cross. In the Cold War, if you were doing the covering force battle when we were waiting for 3rd Shock Army to come, that would have been the Weser, the Rhine, the Mittelland Canal. So this is a withdrawal in contact across a series of bridges that are either prepared or need to be prepared for demolition. And the idea is it's a delaying battle. And in turn, they have to cross each of these in their withdrawal back to Dunkirk. And I think that as a map, and we all know that these are the Netherlands. This is a landscape that is filled with obstacles. Bearing in mind, there are also railway lines, and we will look at those as well, that railway bridges need to be dealt with in exactly the same way as river and canal bridges. And here we have one. This is at Braine-le-Château. And you can go there. This is the old line of the railway. You can see the railway station and the sign at the top left there. And this is one of that Bruce Shand himself had to guard. And he said, the main problem they had on the withdrawal, and we know the story, is that all the bridges are full of refugees, and in some places withdrawing troops as well, certainly the Belgique troops. And he talks about the difficulty that he has trying to clear the bridge. He's trying to blow it before the Germans arrive. He can't get the civilians off it. He shouts at them in French that if they don't get off the bridge, he's going to blow the bridge. And eventually, having cleared the bridge, which took him about 40 minutes, they blew the bridge, but it just wasn't enough explosives to blow it. Which meant pedestrians could still get across. And that's to remember, of course, is that for the engineers as well, and this is David Smith and his crew, this is some of the first practical stuff that they've done dealing with some of the equipment that they've seen for the very first time. There's one account where he's talking about trying to make it work, and there are no instructions, and he says that he actually breaks every explosive safety rule that he's ever been taught to make this thing go bang which indeed he does. And there's a fantastic account of the engineer sergeant using a cam net on this bridge, and it says hanging, looking, and the analogy used is looking like a lover escaping from a woman's window as he's coming down the ladder on the outside of the wall. So very poetic. But this is a railway bridge on the 16th. Just 6 days into it, is one of the first ones that they have to blow. It's blown, but not completely. So just remember, not everything's successful, as we said. The next one is RSM Fox. Oddly, there's been a battlefield study up there today. Anybody that knows Barney, W2 Barney Barnes, he's been up there today with a group of people. And this is just a fantastic story about a man called Fox, Freddie Fox, the RSM. And this whole day, they get shelled off the top. This is during the defense of Arras. From the top here, they can see the Germans arriving, about 40 tanks. They get shelled. The RHQ has to move to the rear. They run a landline forward so they can still communicate back to the headquarters. And we've got a sergeant who's reporting what he can see back to the commanding officer. The commanding officer is reporting it back to Gort. But the sergeant's also reporting it to the armoured car that belongs to the RSM. And the RSM, who ran the regimental shooting team, decides to go hunting with his boy's anti-tank rifle. This turns out later to be an MID action, and he, by engaging the lorries with his boys, okay, he actually inflicts at least 30 casualties on the German infantry with a handheld boy's anti-tank rifle. Eventually, he withdraws back to his armoured car, makes it back safely. But for the whole period of this relay of communications during the artillery bombardment between Lumsden, Gort, and Fox, the radio operator, this is another gallantry award. The next story is on the 23rd, and this is a story about three guys. Okay, it's in a family regiment, which the regiment is today, and a small one to boot, amongst young men, that all losses are felt incredibly keenly. And I'm not supposing for 1 minute they're not felt keenly by infantry battalions or corps or anybody else, but we know that it says here, we never had a grimmer little supper, with a wounded squadron leader and Bruce and John and Andrew being killed that day. So the 23rd was a very expensive day for a squadron. And when you bear in mind there's only 3 troops, officer attrition now is becoming difficult. This is a picture of young Roddick at school. John Hearn himself actually was attached to the regiment from the North Irish Horse. He only came to learn some tactics and some squadron leading. It was intention that he would go back to his own regiment and come with the North Irish Horse and command it in the future, something that he never, of course, managed to do. And then there's the most famous, I mean, we talked about bridges there. I don't think anybody's probably been to Chateau Le Brun, but there's a bridge here that we've all stood on. Fantastic picture here. This is Tim Bishop's armoured car on the 26th, parked under the Menin Gate. And this is what David Smith did to the bridge at the Menin Gate. So, as you can see, the current bridge is a slightly newer addition. What's fascinating, of course, along with the change in neutrality of the Belgians, is there are casualties in the Cloth Hall. And someone from the Cloth Hall goes across to speak to Tim Bishop underneath and says, I hope you're not going to fire that machine gun under the Menin Gate. You do know we've got men convalescing in the Cloth Hall. He never says whether he does or whether he doesn't, but this is the handiwork of David Smith amongst the many bridges that he got to blow. In our regimental story, though, there's the most famous bridge. This is the bridge at Dixmunder, which is blown by a guy called Second Lieutenant Edward Mann, Ned Mann. And this is the bridge he blows. This is what the bridge looked like. I'm sure people will probably are familiar and have driven across this bridge, or the new bridge, a few times. Nothing much has changed. Clearly, there is just a newer bridge. But this is the story of 3 people. Ned Mann on the left, David Smith, of course, and we've got a corporal, Corporal Cyril Glavy. And I'm going to tell their stories with their gallantry award recommendations, because that tells us exactly what we need to know. So, as you can see, Ned Mann gets a DSO, later on an MC, then a Silver Star, and then he's mentioned in his dispatches. So as a young second lieutenant, he starts with a DSO bit like Montgomery in the First World War, very unusual. But it talks about his skillful dispositions, his bold leadership, the inflicting of casualties on the bridge. But by the time he'd blown it, he'd managed to stop 250 vehicles coming down the road, which were all Dunkirk bound. Okay, and turned them into a solid mass. And he held them there for over 7 hours. He was joined by another call sign, to be fair. He wasn't on his own as a second troop. And it just says that had he failed by a less bold action, in other words, him and Smith arbitrarily decide that they are going to blow the bridge. They don't wait for instructions. And it says there that during the few hours, the first few hours, they would be able to clear the beaches from which the BF would finally embark. So within the recommendation for his DSO, the blowing of this single bridge, almost what we call your strategic subaltern or your strategic corporal, this single act alone probably is a major contributing factor. 250 vehicles inbound on this day. And then Smith, he's there. Smith has to do all sorts of bits and pieces. That the bridge had been prepared, and then it had not been prepared, and then he had to find out how it had been done, and he prepped it for blowing. As you can see there, the military cross for David Smith is on about 3 different days, but on the 28th, which is the day we're talking about, the citation at the bottom, talking about the demolitions, without immediate aid, many of the British would have remained intact. So, if I'm really honest, I think Smith at the end of the word probably deserved a bit more. But it says this officer is attached to my regiment. This would indicate, I think, this citation was written by Lumsden himself. And it's Lumsden who brings Smith's gallantry to the attention of the chain of command. I think when we see citations, we go, a very good MC, very strong MC indeed. And then there's Garvey. I don't have a picture of Garvey, but his citation's brilliant. And what they do is they put Garvey with a Bren gun overlooking the bridge. And what Garvey is doing is, as the Germans then are coming forward to ascertain the problem with the bridge or trying to fix the bridge or get the vehicles off the bridge, it says there, at the most critical time, coolness and judgment and devotion of duty, Garvey with his Bren gun keeps along as a part of this 7-hour delay, keeping the Germans off the Dietzmunde Bridge. Without going back, you saw there that the image I used for Garvey was a certificate from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Sadly, Garvey is killed later on the war. This is an MM action for Garvey. So the last bridge, or the most significant bridge, it comes down to 2 second lieutenants and a corporal. That is strategic decision making at the lowest possible level that you can probably come up with. Well, it all comes to the end, and they realise that they have to get back to Dunkirk, and the order is given. I've been a little disingenuous. Only today have I found another 6 pictures of knocked out Morris armoured cars. Now, I had this, and I used it to just remind myself to explain how the process took place. But actually, this isn't a vehicle that they destroyed themselves during withdrawal. This actually was a vehicle that was destroyed. It was Clark Kennedy's vehicle that was destroyed. This is a part of his own MC citation. I felt a little bit disingenuous on reflection, putting out a picture of his knocked out vehicle and maybe insinuating that it was one of those that was self-destroyed. Clark Kennedy is hugely significant because he then is the commanding officer on amalgamation from the 12th to the 9th. In 1960, and although I drew attention to some of the inaccuracies either in the war diary or in the regimental history, he himself in the regimental journal writes a fantastic account of this period, and I would recommend that is drawn upon in conjunction with the war diary and Stuart's history. But the knocking out of the armoured cars, the regiment by this time was in 2 chunks. There was a lot, as you've seen there, had gone up to Ypres, Bishop and Co, and another group had gone further south. Along with all the vehicles, as they got closer, they either drained the oil and ran the engines till they're seized, they fired bullets into them, they used their buoys. But the thing they did more than anything, Camnet set fire to them, poured oil over them, but all of the vehicles were destroyed. And the only reason I mention that is we don't know of any Morrises that have survived. There's certainly not one in the Tank Museum at Bovington. In all the pictures, and those war gamers and modelers they all struggled to find. I don't know of a Morris that exists today. But the thing about it, when they left, though, they did leave in good order, and the men left carrying their weapons and their sidearms, and they all arrived at the beaches in good order, which is significant when we come to later on in the story. So this is the story of them finally arriving at the beaches. This is on the 30th, and this is from the war diary. And the regiment does arrive in good order. It's not in dribs and drabs. It arrives by squadrons. They are marching. They're carrying sidearms, and they are said to be of good military discipline. And when they arrive at Pont, it says that Lumsden was personally directed by the Commander-in-Chief to reorganise the embarkation beaches at La Pont, owing to difficulties which had been experienced on the beach. On the beach, in front of 8th Squadron SHQ, were 4 Bofors anti-tank guns, and the regiment took over the reorganising of 3 embarkation points. They were then assisted by a collection of forming motor transport vehicles on a jetty, on the sand and into the sea, easy to embark for the troops. That's so they could get the big boats in, and the parties were sent off to collect folding boats and ropes abandoned by the engineers. Now, I've taken 2 stock pictures. Those pictures of the lorries and the planks you see all over the internet. I'm not saying that these were done by the 12th Lancers, but it illustrates what they've done. I'm not sure how many Bofors there were on the beach, but there are plenty of Bofors on the beach at Dunkirk. And this is how the beach would have looked like on the 30th for the 12th Lancers. They also talk about how many of the men could swim, which was unusual, and actually some of them using their life-saving training to save people that had been in the water. Likewise, talked about the engineers that they had with them with their artisan trades, working with ropes and planks, etc. So, as you can see here from this, that the 12th Lancers at La Pont Beach were responsible for running 3 embarkation points on the 30th, that we know.
Wow.
But then we get to the 31st, and they're told to make their way to Dunkirk. And when I did my battlefield study, I hadn't got this information, and I wish I had. But Falaise, Henri de la Falaise, who is the French liaison officer, in his book says, Falaise could see a large hotel at the Marlow terminus 2 miles to the east of Dunkirk. Lumsden car passed the column and halted about half a mile ahead of the regiment. When the regiment reached him, he told them the time had come to an end and we were going to embark. So I'm pretty sure, looking at the map, and I can now go and stand on the beach and see exactly whereabouts the Lancers got aboard the boats that were to take them away. As you can see, they didn't make it as far as Dunkirk and to the Mole. They are lifted off by the small ships. But it's the walk. Each one of those squares is a kilometre.
Mm.
That's the best part of an 8-mile down the beach. And it says Falaise, so that Falaise reports that Horsby Porter with 8th Squadron went from Le Pont to Marlow in arrowhead formation down the beach while it was being bombed in good military order. Shan says just like doing an OTC exercise. And they went through the carnage and arrived at the end as a fully formed organisation. To such a degree that when Lumsden had noticed one of the soldiers had not got his Bren gun, he sent him back to get the Bren gun and told him not to rejoin the regiment until he did it. And the soldier walked all the way back to where he dumped it and picked up his Bren gun. On the way, the regiment picked up other rifles, arms full of Bren guns, and anything that they found, they were picking up the rifles on the beach and took them with them until they got to Marlow at the terminus building. And we know a little bit more about it. Hopefully people from the Association of the Dunkirk Little Ships will get to see this. But they were lifted by 2 vessels. One was a paddle steamer. And it says that the whole of the process took about 30 minutes. Eventually, we're clambering aboard a steamer. It's a paddle steamer. But then it talks about when that pulls away, and this is a fantastic statement. I think it is. And it says the only people left net deep in the icy water was Lumsden and the 3 squadron leaders and the 2 French liaison officers, plus a handful of men. Once the steamer had left, a dredger slowly came in to pick them up, and it was a sand dredger which belonged to the Tilby Construction and Bridging Company. we know that the Tigress 1 and the Queen's Channel are two boats that were there that day. We have no idea which one it is. There is a comment made that the crew was a young boy and the skipper was an old man in his 80s, and neither of them, before they came across the Channel, had even left the Thames estuary. So wow. I do believe that the Queen's Channel at some point did run aground. I'm not sure how many trips it made, but they were lifted off by two ships at the terminus at Marlow. So we have a more complete story than that I was able to write about in the past. So, aftermath and lethargy, this is a very short bit, and then we can pick up the questions at the end. So, even the local papers at the end of the war, they all got back, okay? And they said that they held the road to Dunkirk for their comrades of the BEF, and the names we've mentioned there, of the commanding officer, of Shand, of Horse Reporter, Clark Kennedy. These are some of the Gallantry Award decorations that were awarded to the 12th Lancers. Now, bearing in mind, it's only 21 days. If you count the day they get back to Britain, it's probably 22 days. So the regiment has only been in action for the best part of 3 weeks.
Wow.
So this is why we think it's their greatest hour. The greatest hour was a statement made by the previous colonel of the regiment, Colonel Richard Charrington, and I stole it. Probably not the greatest title for selling a book, but it suited my purposes. So in the 21 days, they picked up 5 battle honours, 19 awards, 3 DSOs, 4 MCs, and you can see them listed there, 12 fatalities, of which 2 were not Lancers, so therefore you won't find them in a Commonwealth War Grave search. One was Erne, North Irish Horse, and Arkwright, who was an 11th Hussar, found himself in the UK, didn't go back to Egypt and join them. But we also lose 3 with Phantom Force. So when you look at the 12th Lancer fatalities on the Commonwealth War Grave record, the numbers mathematically do not match. And then also a boat is sunk, and there are casualties that were on that boat who were casualties who then in turn become fatalities. But 21 days, that is what the total. The scoreboard, I know sometimes doing numerics can be a little bit vulgar, but 5 battle honours and 19 awards in 21 days is pretty good going. I won't say only at the loss of 12. 12 men is 12 men from a small regiment. And you saw there that statement about the sad supper, that each loss was keenly felt, is the phrase that was used. But this is where we now go into the legacy. One of the things that eased the modernisation was, you will all know from your various, whatever period you study, that the army always had qualification badges and qualification pay. And the first thing that the 12th Lancers did was awarded the armoured car for a crewman. That if you were a driver and a gunner and a signaller, you got class 2 rates of pay. And right from the beginning, the armoured car was issued. And of course, doing anything for pay, although we alluded to maybe their youth, helping to encourage. And nobody actually wanted to go to war on a horse, as a massive part to do with it is the armoured car as a trade badge, showing that you're a tradesman, was worn with immense pride. Drifted in and out. When I was serving, it was a Class 1's badge, and the regiment now retained this on amalgamation, and it is used as a crew commander, or I think we would refer to it today as a tank commander's badge. But there's even a little bit more of a story, and I did skip last time, just so none of your eagle-eyed watchers never asked, why are all the sergeant majors wearing RQMS's rank badges? Hunt, Fox, Richardson, that's it. You got your glasses on?
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
All wearing. Now, there are lots of stories of why. We do not really know, is the truth. The consensus of the story is they just ran out of the other ones, so issued these to everybody. But it was retained on amalgamation in the 1960s and was retained on amalgamation 10 years ago.
It's some fat stores guy who couldn't be bothered to put the order in, who said, it'll do. That was a cliched, horrible comment, but you know.
You've made my stories far less romantic there, Woody. But as you can see, the armoured car is worn by corporals, denoting he's a vehicle commander. When I was a crew commander, course has always been hard. Every generation says that course was the hardest. It's really hard now. We used to get £5 extra a day, which was well worth having because you retained the pay increment for the rest of your career. But now, this is the you can see a sergeant major today, and this is almost where I'm going to bring it to a conclusion. This is my big thing, that in the regiment today, a sergeant major, the whole Dunkirk story is there on his arm. He's got his WO2's badge with his laurel leaves, which he would have worn at Dunkirk. And there we have the armoured car that had been a train's badge since 1928.
Yeah, great photo.
I'm bringing it now to a conclusion. Of course, there is one set of medals we don't have in the museum or in the mess. And they are Bruce Shan's. This was addressed by Her Majesty Armed Forces Day last year. On the right-hand side, you can see Bruce Shan's medal group. And if you look really closely, you can see he's got a bar to his MC. He got that during serving in Africa, shortly before he was captured. And he was captured while attacking Rommel's headquarters. So again, a man of immense courage and boldness. And then also on the right-hand side, you'll see the wedding photograph of him in his uniform on their wedding day. And that is the link to Her Majesty the Queen, who is currently the Colonel-in-Chief of the Royal Lancers. And this is the link to her via Dunkirk back to 1928. So the story,
let's hope she's watching. I mean, I know she doesn't come in the sidebar because I won't know how to formally address her in the sidebar of a YouTube show. Is there protocol for how you address some royal member of the royal family in a sidebar of an internet forum? There probably is. Someone will probably tell you there's an official way of doing it.
Yeah, Your Majesty would do.
Yeah, that'll do.
So there we go. Bang on the hour. Pleased with that. It's not a book sell, I promise. The point the book was written well before Her Majesty assumed her appointment. We had a battlefield tour that was going to take place on the anniversary. COVID stopped that. The book was in full flow. Already, as the Duchess of Cornwall, she was engaged and already promised that she would write the foreword to the book, which she did. The book itself, you can buy the bike from me, but you can get it cheaper on eBay. I can't compete against the big book companies, although, of course, I will sign it for you. There is an Amazon review, and I would like to address my Amazon review. It got 5 stars. He only gave me 4.5, but begrudgingly gave me 5. But one of the comments he makes is I've put contemporary coloured maps in, but I've dated them all, but I put no markings on. And there's a reason for that is if Watson puts a circle on a map or a line, that where I would say could be, would be, should be, or maybe would become a definite. The book was written with a long term, like the 2 guys that are out there doing a battlefield study. The book itself, the maps are there for you to use, and all of the 6 and 4-figure grid references in the text match the maps. So it is a complete work, so people don't have to go and find their own Michelin maps or maps from 1918, which are no use. That's me. I mean, without being overly cheesy, I would like to dedicate this to Her Majesty, of course, and I hope I've done her father justice. And of course, the Colonel of the regiment and the serving regiment today. I hope that within that we have mentioned and that we discussed, even they can recognise themselves somewhere in the story. Because certainly Her Majesty in the book says that there's much of the regiment that she sees today that her father would recognise. Thank you, Woody. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Well, brilliant. Well, we're not going to let you off quite so quickly. We've got a few questions. So we had one a bit earlier on when you're talking about the river and bridge actions particularly, and it was, were the Lancers able to call targets for the RAF? A good question. I'm going to come back with a resounding, I bet it's very unlikely.
They talk about the RAF, and there's the 2 threads, which is where are the bloody RAF? Yeah. And then those that say, we know where they are, they're just dealing with stuff that's far more important. So, and of course, they then do see in the RAF finally when they get to beaches. So they do some practice and ground-to-air communications during the phony war to Blenheims, but there is no indication of any interaction. They do, well, they pick up a crashed airman and they ask him what's going on. It's all in the book, but they do pick him up, but there is no ground-to-air communication. If we go later on and we're looking at Italy, when we're rolling up from the Po, and we've got the combined forces, and we've got the cab rank where we've got ground-to-air communications. No, we are 4 years from there.
Okay, thank you. Terry Down made that it's a comment rather than a question. This presentation is subtly making a point. The BEF wasn't saved by luck or German mistakes so much as it saved itself by hard fighting. I think a very appropriate comment there. There's lots of discussion in the sidebar about Hitler's infamous hold order, and absolutely that was to have an influence on things there. But you have reminded us again, Philip, that it is these actions. People talking about the other towns like Cassel and the stuff on the various canals. There are other groups of guardsmen and infantry, and essentially people from all regiments there that are making that difference. And I think we have an idea, maybe from movies and imagery, that it's all a bit disorganized and haphazard. And sure, there are units that weren't quite in the right place, and there's a little bit of failure to understand the wider picture. But everything I've ever read about these rearguard actions is that within the regimental size units, they do know what they're doing. They do have a grasp of things. They are acting professionally. This idea that it's all a bit, random is, I think we need to quash that.
There's another point as well, which is, and just to pick up on that thread, which is there's a decision-making process when to pull the plug. And the person that's making that is GHQ and Gort, and he can only make that with the information he's being given. Of course, you've got 6 divisions out there, so that's 6 regiments doing recce in their light tanks, but they're going via brigade into via division. I have no real opinion on the quality of the communications from the divisional reconnaissance. Whether it worked or whether it didn't, or a bit like the French, whether they used it or not, is irrelevant. What we're talking, the Russians used to call this in the Cold War, it's called skip echelon communications. Your formation recce here is speaking from the front right the way into Gort's headquarters. And what it means is that Gort, or his headquarters, can ask them a direct question. And of course, in Morse, in the old days, when you're sending messages backwards and forwards, and even now with dispatch riders, as you saw, they had motorbikes, is what we always forget about radio communications is that you can question, and you can be inquisitive, and you can have a conversation, and you've got the name of somebody who is looking at something. And if you turn around, and I imagine there's a conversation at some point when when Gort's turn around and says, "Where have you got that information from?" And somebody like General Friend goes, "That's come from the 12th Lancers from Lumsden." And you go, right, that's believable information, because the credibility for that 21 days provides him with real-time accurate information, in which he's making massively grown-up decisions. And one of them is pulling the plug. There's a very famous day, and I didn't put it in my book because I couldn't corroborate it, which there's a certain day when Gort actually sends his kit back to Britain. Okay, so all of that and that whole thing about the census and collecting the boats together, that has to be made on a certain amount of information. And of course, it is coming in by the divisions. And this whole piece about Montgomery may be feeling somewhat usurped by Lumsden is a whole part of that fantastic conspiracy narrative that we find in all of the genres that we talk about. But one thing is Gort's go-to man for real-time information is Lumsden and the 12th Lancers. And that, I think, is missing from all of the narratives.
Thank you. Trevor Sheehan, Africa, Stalingrad in Africa, is asking, has Philip visited the Tunisia route of the regiment? Were there any 1940 Dunkirk veterans in 1943 Tunisia? And don't forget, Trevor, you've still got to get in touch about doing these shows about wink, wink, nudge, nudge, Tunisia. But and Ian also said earlier, Philip, what did Ian say? Ian said, will you come back and do North Africa from the regiment? So that's 2 questions in one there. Have you traveled that route? Will you come back and do the next era?
Well, the question is no, because when that battlefield tour took place, I wasn't at regimental duty, so I missed it. Will I come back and do it? Yes, I would. We've got quite a lot of what I call unpublished stuff, sort of hoovering up what's available. There's not enough for a new book. There certainly isn't. But I am not familiar with the Desert Campaign. When you then look at what people do after, and we've discussed this at length, which is, the forgotten narrative. Are we all right for time for Woody?
Yeah, fine. Yeah, keep going.
Okay, so this is the conversation, which is the 12th Lancers had a regimental day called Waterloo Day, and it ran with Waterloo Day until it did the Boer War, and then it charged at Diamond Hill, and then it has Diamond Hill Day. And then it runs Diamond Hill Day until it charges at Muida Lane during the retreat from Mons on the 28th of August 1914. And then it changes from Diamond Hill Day to Moy Day. And it keeps Moy Day all the way to amalgamation. The exam question is if this was their greatest hour, why did they not change Moy Day to Dunkirk Day? And it's a question we don't know, because at the end of the day, what they do is equally as significant, is so significant in that 21 days. It's really quite mind-blowing. When you're talking about battle honours and honours awards, that's what you normally look at places like Rorke's Drift for, or how many VCs are won before breakfast. It fits that very powerful narrative that we discuss. Obviously, Dunkirk itself is seen as a strategic failure. Of course, being British, we rescue defeat or victory from defeat, which we tend to do. But of course, by the time they get then to Africa and Italy, and this is to go back to the question about going to Africa, is that they fight with equal distinction. By the time we get now Horsby Porter, okay, he's now the commanding officer of the 27th Lancers, a wartime race. He gets another DSO, and every single person who we've mentioned, apart from Henri de Falaise, you've got to Google him. He is more famous for his affairs with Hollywood film actresses than anything else. He's got a very big page on Wikipedia. But all of these people we've spoken about, Ned Mann, you saw another military cross, a Bronze Star, they all fight in Italy, they all fight in Africa with equal distinction. So they are able to replace the Dunkirk story with stories of equal valor. And of course, the worst thing about Dunkirk, and it comes through in the whole, everything, is the pitiful refugees, the people, what happens to the population. The desert is a clean war. It's pretty soldier on soldier. There are not many civilians. So there are probably some, we don't know the answer. I hate people pressing me for a real answer, and I'm more than content to go, I simply don't know. But we didn't change the regimental day. And all of them served with distinction. As I said, Clark Kennedy was still serving in the commanding officer in amalgamation in 1960. Horsby Porter, likewise, double DSO winner. So they go on to do other things.
We'll have to do a show at some point with you or someone else about how much, or if any, of Gort's influence about what the 12th Lancers were doing in terms of reconnaissance influenced the creation of the Reconnaissance Corps itself in 1941. Now, Gort goes off and he's ADC to George VI. He goes off to Malta later, but clearly this is working. Clearly this idea of having fast reconnaissance being brought back by fast-moving vehicles and bypassing a bit of a chain of command works well, and that's essentially what the Recce Corps was all about. We have to do something about the founding of the Recce Corps, because I can't think that the Dunkirk story can't have had some involvement in the creation of the Recce Corps.
I think the Bartholomew report, I mean, when we spoke last time, you nodded. It's worth a read. Not because, firstly, because a part of my studies, my PhD, is doctrine, which I know can be awfully tedious for some people. But what historians do, they love to speculate with their own theories in the vacuums and the gaps that history leaves. And then, of course, they can pontificate on how things should have been better. Quite tedious. I'm far more interested in what the army thought. I think people at times look for conspiracies, but they don't realise the army is staggeringly self-critical. And it doesn't matter whether you're looking at Isha or Ether reports or the Haldanes or the Cardwell reforms, the army is evolving all the time. But when we have the reforms, these are massive hard stops where, as an organisation or a government, we go, it didn't go as well as we thought it was going to do. So you have a continually evolving army, and then we have periods of reform. Reform doesn't mean evolution is not taking place, and we know that. And the Bartholomew report about numbers of radios, and they talk about the fact is one of the stifling effects on the inability for, because HF communications, if anybody has used it, you've got to be a good radio operator. You've got to know your stuff. You've got to work at it. It needs tuning. It needs retuning. You've got to match your antennas. There's a lot of work to be done. But of course, they practiced that during the phony war. But because of communications and MCON silence was imposed during the phony war, many of the regiments didn't have the opportunity to practice radio communications. That might, with a big M, be a contributing factor to a shortfall in radio communications during the period. But the Bartholomew report, it's downloadable, it's free. I'd recommend anybody, if you're going to have an opinion on this, go and read what the army thinks, because it is very critical. And the reason you need to read it is because we don't, like the Kirk report, in 1932 after World War I, we don't write a report after the Second World War, do we? The only report you've got to read if you want to do any analysis is the Bartholomew report. It's free online, so I recommend you download it for free. Archive.org, it's always good.
Brilliant. So Andrew added that the Recce Corps happened because they put all the cavalry and tanks to match the panzers. That seems to be something we'll drill down on in a future episode. But I'm going to leave the final word to our mutual friend, Philip Spencer Baldwin. Hi, Woody and Philip. This is an absolutely absorbing program. Wonderful to learn from. Thank you both. And Spencer, we're just reminiscing in the cyber. 21 years ago this month, we were bombing around Arnhem in a Jeep, recce core Jeep together. So it seems like yesterday, doesn't it, Spencer? So it's crazy when two parts of my kind of life, my World War II TV current life, kind of merges with my old reenactment life via you, Philip, because you kind of this triangle of connections. It's the old 7 degrees of separation. Everybody knows everybody else. So I'll leave those final words with Spencer. It's good to get in touch with you here. Thank you, Philip. It's been fantastic stuff. I will extend an invitation to come back at some point in the future, either continue the 12 Lancer story or do something else about doctrine or army learning generally. But tomorrow, folks, 2 shows tomorrow. So 8 o'clock UK time. I'm talking to Dave Holland about Guadalcanal, and then 8 p.m. So 12 hours later, we're looking at the 40 Thieves, a particularly interesting sniper reconnaissance scout platoon on Saipan. So that's the 2 shows tomorrow. As always, click like and subscribe, buy my guest books, read their blogs, etc., etc. There's my copy of Philip's book. It's sitting there. It'll go back on the shelf with other British Army titles. I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye. Thanks, Philip.
Cheers. Thanks, Woody.